The day they buried my son, I shook hands with his wife at the graveside and thought she had the saddest eyes I had ever seen. I was wrong about that. His name was Edmund, 34 years old. Healthy, or so we all believed. He'd gone to bed on a Tuesday night and didn't wake up Wednesday morning. His wife, Celeste, found him. She called me before she called anyone else, which I thought was strange later, but at the time, I was too broken to think straight. I drove 40 minutes to their house in Fairview with my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached for 2 days after. The funeral was small. Edmund didn't have many friends. He was a quiet man, always had been, even as a boy. He liked fishing and crossword puzzles and making his own pasta from scratch on Sunday afternoons. He called me every Thursday evening without fail, even when he was busy, even when he was tired. 7 o'clock my phone would ring, and it would be him. The Thursday after he died, I sat in my kitchen for 2 hours waiting for a call I knew wasn't coming. Celeste stood beside me at the graveside, and she was crying. Real tears, the kind that reddened your face and made your shoulders shake. I put my arm around her and told her Edmund loved her very much. She nodded and pressed her face into my shoulder. I held her up. I was 63 years old, and I just buried my only child, and I was the one holding her up. There was a moment, just before they began lowering the casket, when I looked across the grave and saw a man I didn't recognize. Tall, late 30s, dark jacket. He wasn't part of our group. He stood about 30 feet away between 2 older headstones, watching. Not grieving, watching. The way you watch something you've been waiting to see confirmed. When I looked again a minute later, he was gone. I told myself grief makes you see things that aren't there. I filed it away and forgot about it for a while. 2 weeks after the funeral, Dr. Okonkwo called me. He had been Edmund's doctor for almost 8 years. A careful, measured man who chose his words slowly. When he asked me if I could come to his office, and when I asked if we could talk over the phone, he said, "Mr. Alderman, I would really prefer you came in, and I'd ask that you not mention this to Celeste before we speak." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and felt the floor shift under me. "What is this about?" I asked. He said, "There are some results from Edmund's final blood work that I want to go over with you in person. I want to be careful." That's all I can say right now. I drove to his office the next morning. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the recliner Edmund had helped me move in 3 years ago, the two of us laughing because we couldn't figure out how to get it through the hallway. And I stared at the ceiling until it was light enough to get up and make coffee. Dr. Okonkwo closed the door to his office before he even sat down. He had a folder on his desk. He opened it slowly. He told me that Edmund's blood work, run in the weeks before his death as part of a routine checkup, had come back with something unusual. Elevated levels of a compound used in certain prescription anticoagulants. Edmund was not prescribed any anticoagulant. He had no condition that would require one. When Dr. Okonkwo had first seen the result, he'd assumed it was a lab error and ordered a retest. The second test confirmed the first. Edmund had anticoagulants in his system that he had no reason to have. At the time of the blood work, the levels were elevated but not dangerous. Edmund came in, and Dr. Okonkwo told him about the result and asked if he'd taken anything. Supplements, borrowed medication, anything. Edmund said no and seemed genuinely puzzled. They agreed to monitor it. Edmund died 11 days later in his sleep from what was recorded as cardiac arrest. Dr. Okonkwo had gone back and looked at the final tox screen after the death. He had called in a favor with the pathologist. What they found was that by the time Edmund died, those levels had climbed significantly. He looked at me across the desk and said, "Someone was giving this to him over time. That is the only explanation that fits." I heard the words. I understood the words individually, but they didn't come together into meaning right away. It was like hearing something in a foreign language that you almost speak. "You're telling me my son was poisoned," I said. Dr. Okonkwo said he wasn't able to use that word. He said he was telling me what the data showed and that he felt I deserved to know before he made any decisions about next steps. He looked at me steadily and said, You need to be careful about who you speak to about this, until things are clearer. I drove home. I don't remember the drive. I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. I thought about Celeste. She and Edmund had met 6 years ago at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. She was pretty and laughed easily and seemed to make Edmund lighter somehow. He'd always carried a kind of seriousness in him that I worried about sometimes. With Celeste, he smiled more. I was grateful for that. I welcomed her like a daughter. I included her in everything, every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary Sunday dinner. I thought about the way she had cried at the graveside. I thought about the man watching from between the headstones. I started paying attention to things I should have paid attention to earlier. The mind protects you when you're grieving. It softens the edges of things. But once someone puts a word to what you're feeling, the softness goes away and you start to see clearly. I remembered that Celeste had suggested Edmund get a full checkup in the months before he died. She'd been insistent about it, said she had a feeling he'd been tired lately, said she wanted him to get a proper panel done. Edmund had mentioned it to me on one of our Thursday calls, said it was probably nothing, but Celeste was worried. I'd told him it was a good idea, that she was looking out for him. I remembered that she handled all the cooking. Edmund had laughed about it once, said he wasn't allowed in his own kitchen. Celeste ran that room like a general. I'd thought it was sweet at the time. I remembered that Edmund had mentioned, casually, maybe 3 months before he died, that they'd taken out life insurance policies. Both of them. He'd said Celeste had arranged it, said it made sense, said he'd signed the papers without thinking much about it. I'd nodded along. Of course that made sense. I remembered the man at the funeral. I went back to Dr. Okonkwo's office 5 days later, and I told him I thought we needed to involve the police. He agreed. He had already been thinking the same thing, but had wanted to wait until he'd spoken to me. He had all the documentation in order. 2 detectives came to my house on a Thursday evening, 7 o'clock, the same time Edmund used to call. I told them everything I knew, including the man at the funeral, including the life insurance, including what I remembered about the cooking, about the insistence on the checkup, about all of it. I felt strange laying it out like that, like I was building a case against someone my son had loved, but I kept thinking about those test results, about 11 days, about how much those levels had climbed in 11 days. The detectives listened to all of it and wrote things down and didn't give much away. They asked me not to change my behavior towards Celeste. They asked me to keep in contact with her as I normally would. That was the hardest part. I called her that Sunday. We talked for 40 minutes. She told me she'd been going through Edmund's things, boxing some of them up. Said she hoped I'd want some of his books. Said she'd saved a few of his sweaters in case I wanted them. Her voice broke twice. I said yes to everything. I told her I appreciated her thinking of me. I hung up and sat in the kitchen for a long time. The detectives worked quietly. I didn't hear from them for almost 3 weeks, and the silence was its own kind of torture. I kept going over things in my head at night, kept second-guessing myself, kept thinking maybe I was doing something terrible to a woman who had genuinely loved my son and was genuinely grieving. The mind will do that to you. It will try to protect you from the thing you're doing, even when the thing you're doing is necessary. Then they called. The man at the funeral had a name. His name was Philip Dorsey, and he and Celeste had been seeing each other for 14 months. They had a shared email account, one of those private ones couples sometimes make, where both people log into the same inbox. The detectives had found messages going back nearly a year. I don't want to repeat what those messages contained. I read some of them later, and I wish I hadn't. What I will say is that there was a clear and documented conversation between Celeste and this man about Edmund's life insurance policy, about how long it would take to investigate a claim, about what a natural-looking cause of death would require. They were careful about their language, but not careful enough. There were also messages discussing something referred to only as the supplement, discussions about increasing the amount, discussions about timing. Edmund had been taking what he thought was a B12 supplement every morning. Celeste had given it to him in a little amber bottle she said she'd ordered online. She'd told him his energy would improve. He mentioned it to me once, said he wasn't sure it was doing anything, but Celeste had read good things about it. The bottle was found in the house during the search. It was not B12. I learned all of this in pieces over the course of several weeks. The detectives were careful about what they shared with me and when, but I want you to understand what it felt like to learn it. It wasn't like in the movies where someone hands you information and you react in a big visible way. It was quieter than that. Each new thing landed in me like a stone dropping into water. A small sound, and then rings spreading out and out, disturbing everything it touched. My son's wife had been poisoning him. She had done it gradually, carefully, over months. She had gotten him to a doctor specifically so that the blood work would be on record. I think she intended to claim he had some undiagnosed condition to create a paper trail of illness. What she hadn't counted on was that Dr. Okonkwo would find the compound, run a second test, and decide that I deserved to know. If he hadn't called me, I would never have known. The arrest happened on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after I'd first walked into Dr. Okonkwo's office. Celeste was taken into custody at the house she'd shared with my son. Philip Dorsey was arrested the same morning at his apartment in a city 2 hours away. They were charged together. I heard about the arrest from one of the detectives, who called me that afternoon. I thanked him. I sat down on the kitchen floor, which is not something I typically do. I just needed to be lower somehow. I sat there for a long time. The trial took 8 months. I attended every day I was able to. Celeste had a good defense attorney, and there were moments when I genuinely worried, when arguments were made about lab error, about coincidence, about the nature of the compound, and whether it could have come from another source. Those were long days. I'd drive home in the dark and sit in Edmund's old recliner and talk to him. Which I know sounds like something a man my age shouldn't admit. But I'd say, "We're still here, Ed. We're still working on it." The jury deliberated for 3 days. Guilty on all counts for Celeste. First-degree murder, conspiracy, fraud. She was sentenced to 40 years. Philip Dorsey, who the prosecution established as a co-conspirator in the planning stages, but who had not been present for the actual administration, was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 22 years. When the verdict was read, I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I thought I would feel some kind of release. Instead, I just sat in that courtroom and thought about Thursday evenings, about pasta from scratch, about the sound of my son's voice when he called, always right on time. Justice doesn't give you back what you lost. I think people sometimes expect it to, and when it doesn't, they feel cheated. I don't feel cheated. The justice was real and it mattered. But Edmund is still gone, and no verdict changes that. What I want to say to anyone who's listening to this is that grief can blind you at exactly the moment you need to see clearly. I held that woman up at my son's graveside. I called her on Sundays. I called her on Sundays. I said yes to everything she offered me, and I'm not ashamed of any of that, because I was acting out of love for Edmund, for the life he had chosen, for what I believed his marriage had been. But I am also the person who walked into a doctor's office and listened, who paid attention when something felt wrong, who trusted a careful, decent physician who chose to make a phone call when he could have stayed quiet. If Dr. Okonkwo had filed that blood work away and said nothing, Celeste would have collected the insurance and moved on. Philip Dorsey would have been introduced to the family eventually as someone new she'd met. The whole thing would have dissolved into history. One phone call. That's what changed everything. I'm 64 now. I still live in the same house. I still sit in Edmund's recliner when I can't sleep. I started keeping a small notebook on the kitchen table where I write down the things I want to remember. Things he said, things we did together. The sound of his laugh. I'm afraid of forgetting the details. The big things you keep. It's the small things that slip away. I write them down so they don't. I keep thinking about a Tuesday night. Edmund went to bed, and by Wednesday morning he was gone. Nothing dramatic. No warning anyone could point to. Just a man who called his father every Thursday at 7 o'clock, and then one Thursday the phone didn't ring. The hardest thing I've had to sit with isn't the anger, though the anger came, and it was real. The hardest thing is knowing that I held Celeste up at that graveside. I put my arm around her and told her Edmund had loved her. And I meant it. I wasn't wrong to do that. I was acting from the truest thing I knew, which was love for my son and for the life he had built. But love, without clear eyes, can make you blind at exactly the moment you most need to see. What changed everything wasn't some dramatic confrontation. It was a phone call from a careful man who paid attention. Dr. Okonkwo didn't have to call me. He could have filed those results away and moved on. What he did instead took a certain kind of moral backbone, the quiet, unglamorous kind that doesn't announce itself. He looked at the data, he thought about what it meant, and he decided that telling the truth mattered more than staying comfortable. That's not a small thing. That's actually the whole thing. I think about the choices Celeste made, not because I enjoy it, but because understanding them is part of how I'd made sense of what happened. She was not a careless person. What she did required patience and planning, and the ability to look someone in the face every single day while doing it. That kind of calculated harm doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a place where other people have stopped being real to you, where a life becomes a number on an insurance document. Whatever she told herself to make it possible, the world she built on that foundation collapsed completely. Everything she gained from Edmund's death she lost, and then far more. That's not poetic justice. That's just what happens when you build something on the deliberate destruction of another person. It doesn't hold. What I want to say to anyone listening is this: pay attention. Not in a fearful way. Not in a way that poisons every relationship you have with suspicion. But pay attention. When something feels wrong, let yourself sit with that feeling instead of explaining it away. I explained things away for months. I softened the edges because grief told me to, and because I wanted to believe the best. There is nothing wrong with wanting to believe the best. But there is something necessary about being willing to look at the hard thing when someone puts it in front of you. I drove to that doctor's office not knowing what he was going to tell me. I could have said I'd rather not know. I didn't. And every answer that came after, every piece of evidence, every step toward justice, came from that one decision to keep going, even when I was terrified of what I might find. Edmund was a quiet man who liked crossword puzzles and handmade pasta and calling his father on Thursday evenings. He deserved better than what happened to him. The best I can do now is remember him clearly. Tell his story honestly and trust that the truth, even when it's painful, is always worth the cost of finding it. I still write things down in that notebook on the kitchen table. Small things, mostly. The way he laughed. Something he said once about the stars. Things I'm afraid of losing. I write them down so they don't.